You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net if you want more information. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Neil Lanctot. He's an historian and an author of several books, including a biography of Baseball Hall of Famer Roy Campanella. His latest volume is called The Approaching Storm: Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and Their Clash Over America's Future. It's already garnered strong reviews from outlets such as Library Journal and Publishers Weekly. It's a terrific book. It's well written, full of great stories and asides. Dr. Lanctot earned a PhD from the University of Delaware in 2002. Thank you, sir, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that very nice introduction.
Is it fair to say that this book would be a little bit of a departure from your previous works, which have kind of centered a little bit on baseball and some African-American history in the early 20th century?
It would be correct to say that. I felt that I had done enough work in that area that I said everything I had to say about, I've done the works on the Negro Leagues, I've done the bio on Roy Campanella, and I wanted to do something that was more broad-based as far as its appeal. Do something in American history that would not be limited to sports readers, which, surprising to say, is not as big as you would think. We have a lot of people who like sports in America, but not necessarily that many people who want to read about sports. So I was looking for something that I thought would be interesting to myself and also to potential readers, and that's what's led me to a new topic and a new area of focus.
Did your previous books kind of give you a sense of the mood, of the temperature of the country during this time period before World War I?
No, actually what inspired me to write this book was I had been looking through a series of books written in the 1920s and 30s by Mark Sullivan. Mark Sullivan was a pretty famous journalist in his time, not so well known now, but Sullivan was somebody who wrote a 6-volume series in the 1920s and early 30s about the prior 25 years in American history from the perspective of someone who had lived through it. And Sullivan knew everyone. He was very well connected, and he was friends with all the movers and shakers. So he wrote this very interesting series of books, great social history written in the 20s and 30s about the prior 25 years. And I had obtained a copy of that series and started to thumb through it. And when I started to read about the World War I sections, there's actually a couple of volumes, I was thinking, this is so much interesting stuff in here on what was going on in the United States. And it's not something that we as Americans are familiar with. And I think there's a great story in here to tell. And that's what led me to decide to tackle this topic. Because what I realized is that America's decision to get involved in World War I is one of the most important decisions the country ever made, because it basically affects the outcome of World War I. Obviously, both sides were in a stalemate until the United States entered the war. and that certainly helped facilitate the eventual defeat of Germany. Now, if those two sides had if they had continued to fight to a stalemate, maybe some sort of negotiated peace had occurred, and then you have the entire history of the remainder of the 20th century being different. So America getting involved in the war, helping in the defeat of Germany, of course, affects the trajectory of the 20th century with the Treaty of Versailles and reparations and Hitler and then another war. If the United States doesn't get involved in the war, we have a potentially entirely different scenario for the 20th century. So it was an extraordinarily important decision for the country. And I think World War I tends to get neglected in the American experience because our actual military participation is fairly brief compared to World War II. So what I was trying to do here is to try to center our experience and see how important it was for us to make this decision and how it came to be, and then tell the story through these three individuals.
Depending on the historian, America is described as isolationist, non-interventionist, or neither, both. What's your take? How would you define the United States' attitude and actions towards Europe in the years preceding the war?
It depends on the part of the country is what I would say. And I think that's even true in the buildup towards the war. I think the East Coast was more of an interventionist streak. But as you moved west and as you moved down south, there was a great disconnect with what's going on around the world. Roosevelt, who's one of the individuals, of course, that I focus on in this book, Roosevelt even mentioned, our people don't understand foreign affairs and aren't particularly interested in learning about them. So I think a certain segment of the country, yes, was very connected to what's going on in Europe and immediately felt when the European war starts that we have to have some sort of involvement, whether it's military or some other supportive way. But in the hinterlands, I would say, and in the South and on the West Coast, the interest and the desire to be involved in European affairs was fairly insignificant.
It really comes through in your book. That was something I'd never really considered. You read about, it was the Wall Street interest and the mercantile and commercial interests who were favoring Great Britain, almost from August 4th, 1914 and on. But your point about the geography was something that I just had never really considered, that people who were a little, farther west into the country from the East Coast had a completely different attitude.
Yeah, and one of the issues, of course, that's going to keep flaring up again and again in the 2.5 years, or whatever it is, for the outset of war and our eventual involvement, is American travel, and American travel and potential of Americans being killed by German submarines. People on the East Coast who were going to travel abroad, that was a big important issue for them. But then you have masses of people in the United States who never traveled to Europe, had no reason to go to Europe. It's like, why is this important to us? Why do we care about American travel? Is it really worth us getting involved in a war because some Americans who want to travel to Europe are being killed? Now, on the East Coast, as I said, very important to people who had business there, want to travel there. But in parts in the West and in the South, it was just not a concern to them. And I think that there was always this difference of opinion. And I think I have a quote in the book from Colonel House, who was Wilson's advisor. And Colonel House told a British official something to the effect that whatever the opinion is on the East Coast is the opposite of what the rest of the country thinks. So, and you can even say in today's world, the East Coast is a very different way of looking at things compared to the rest of the country. So, I mean, we have a large country here. We had a large country in 1915, and we have even larger one today. So there was never, ever one single opinion. And I think what President Wilson, of course, will be trying to contend with is how do you tie all these opinions together? How do you get what the people seem to want as far as policy is concerned? How do you take that and create some sort of policy which is acceptable to the country and get himself reelected because he's going to deal with an election in 1916? I think one thing that Wilson realized, he said, what the country wants is firmness towards, the Germans and even the Allies, but not too firm that might get us involved in the war. So it's like, be firm, but not too firm. And that's this he's trying to thread that needle. That's what Wilson tries to do, to keep us out of the war as long as he possibly can.
You mentioned this just a few minutes ago. Let's go back to it for just a second. On the litany of watershed decisions in American history, where would you rank the vote to enter World War I? And what would be two or three others? Complete the Mount Rushmore for us. And what would be your four biggest decisions in American history?
I think this decision to go to World War I would be in the top five. I think definitely. I think the decision to drop the atomic bomb would be another watershed decision. I think Pearl Harbor, the decision to go to World War II, enter World War II, would be another one. Probably the decision to American Revolution would be certainly another. Obviously, or is that cheating because it's not really, we're not in the United States yet? But I think that's obviously a very important decision. Probably Lincoln deciding not to just let the South go in peace, deciding we're going to prevent secession. We're going to make sure we're going to have to go to war. So I think that would be another one. So those are the biggies in off the top of my head, as far as unbelievably significant decisions that probably change the shape of our future.
And all of the examples you listed involve conflict. In 2021, in the last generation, 2 or 3, United States deciding to send its men overseas is commonplace, right? It's dog bites man. But in 1917, it's man bites dog.
Yes.
Exactly how big of a decision, of how much of a departure was it for the United States to decide to send its men over to Europe?
Well, it's an interesting question, because even up to the point when we declared war, there were many Americans, even many people in Congress, who thought, okay, we're declaring war, but that does not mean we're going to send troops. Right. There was a belief even, okay, well, we'll use the American Navy, we'll convoy British ships, and we'll contribute our money and our we'll continue supplying the Allies with munitions, but sending an army over, no, that's not going to happen. And of course, that wasn't even that surprising, because our army in 1915, 16, 17 was so small and so insignificant. It was about 100 and something thousand. And that's one of the themes of the book, is Roosevelt trying again and again to push the country towards what they call preparedness, military preparedness. Right. So it seemed almost fantastic, the idea of sending a massive American army over the Atlantic Ocean to France and Belgium. It just seemed absolutely inconceivable that it would happen. And of course, it does happen. An interesting thing also, if the war had gone on longer, we would have had, I don't know how many millions of American troops in Europe, which might have also changed Wilson's power at the Treaty of Versailles. There would have been more American troops there, and our participation in the war would have been greater. He would have had greater oomph at the peace table than he actually had. But yes, it was a complete game changer, something that was unthinkable. Of course, we had deployed American troops, but in much smaller increments. I mean, Wilson had sent troops to various Latin American countries, and of course, we'd been involved in the Spanish-American War. But going to Europe like that was just not thought of, not even believed to be possible before this war.
Looking back through history, it seems that sometimes wars happen despite evident prosperity. I've read more than one book, and I laugh because I believe it, about how spoiled rotten the colonists were prior to the American Revolution, that they were incredibly prosperous, and some of their grievances were a little more contrived than others. And then Europe in 1914 was hardly trudging through a depression. Why do wars sometimes happen when, if you take a step back and look at the wider view, things are going pretty darn well?
Well, I suppose it's always about greed. It's always about, we had mentioned before starting an interview, Germany, and Germany wanted what England had to some degree. They wanted the colonies, they wanted the power. And and they were prepared for war. And the Germans were also felt threatened by the Russians. And the idea was we can solve a lot of our problems. War was not a fearful thing to them. Now, did they think it was going to spiral out of control the way it did? I don't think no one in summer of 1914 could have believed it was going to turn out the way it turned out. And I think even in the very beginning, there was a thought that it would be over quickly. But all of a sudden, it spiraled into the worst cataclysm in history up to that point.
It seems like go ahead, sir. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I was going to say the economic issue is also interesting as well. I mean, America benefited a great deal from the war even before we got involved ourselves, because the country was probably, I don't know if it was quite in a recession in 1914, but we weren't doing, there was some struggle. There was a lot of unemployment. Once the war begins and we start supplying, particularly the Allies, supplying them with munitions, the American economy just booms, and that takes us out of it. And it's going to be resentment among the Europeans on both sides that the Americans are getting rich off our misery. I mean, the flower of our youth, be it the German side or the British side and the French side, whatever, are dying, and the Americans, the Yankees, as they would call them, are making money hand over fist. So that's another interesting part of the war. The Europeans had this belief about us anyway at that time that we were nothing but a materialistic society anyway, and we knew nothing about honor or sacrifice, and it's all they care about is money. And it's interesting to read some of the diplomatic dispatches from Cecil Spring Rice, who was he was the British diplomat in Washington, and he's writing back to London saying, these people, they're not raised to be about honor. That's all they care about is making a buck, and we can't expect their help. And so there was that view of Americans that's all they care about. They're not like us.
And the South said that about the North before the Civil War. They're just they don't have any honor. They're just in it for the money. They're industrial. They don't have elan.
Yes, and I think the Germans said that about the British, that they were a nation of shopkeepers, as I recall. So they're not soldiers.
Bismarck said that. I think it was Napoleon. Napoleon.
Yeah, someone said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about. You mentioned three people in the subheading in your book. Let's talk about them for just a few minutes. I confess to have not read much about Teddy Roosevelt for reasons that I really can't defend, but what I have read about him, he seems to be as much of a phenomenon as he was a president. How dominant of a personality and a figure was he in this time period?
I don't think there's ever been a president like Roosevelt, frankly. Someone who, while he was president, was such a captivating figure, such a fascinating individual who was so recognizable with the look, with the glasses and the smile and the saying bully and the delighted. And I talk about this in the book, that he was a celebrity, in a way that very few presidents are celebrities. Maybe JFK would have fallen into that category. People who may not care about politics, but they're actually almost rock stars. And I think TR was in some ways a rock star in his time, particularly when he was president, because he did everything. He was a brilliant individual. Plus he was, he was an explorer, and he could converse on just about every topic known to man. And so Americans were fascinated with him, completely fascinated with him. But at the time of the book, when the book starts in 1914, his career is actually on the downslide. He had served in the White House. After he got out of the White House, everything seemed to go wrong for him. I mean, the man he had picked as his replacement, his friend William Howard Taft, turned out not to be what Roosevelt thought he was going to be as far as following his policies. And then Roosevelt decided he wanted to be president again, and the Republicans wouldn't nominate him, so he ran for president under a new party, the Progressives. He lost to Wilson in 1912. And when the book starts, he's kind of at a loss what to do next, because the Progressive Party, the party that he had formed, is kind of falling apart. It's not doing what he thought it's going to do. He absolutely detests the man in the White House, Woodrow Wilson. I mean, that's one big part of this book, is the competition between these men. And what particularly galls him is that Wilson is in the White House during what Roosevelt soon comes to realize is the event of his lifetime. a global war, and he's not in the White House to be handling it. And he comes to believe that Wilson is doing just about everything wrong, mishandling every part of foreign policy. And Roosevelt, he just, he outwardly says, Wilson's the worst president we've ever had. He's a disaster.
James Buchanan is smiling.
Yeah, the hatred of him is so intense. He just absolutely despises this individual that he's in the White House. Some of it's personal, some of it's philosophical. They had once been cordial, before, but of course they're on two sides of the political fence, Democrats, but they're both progressives. And that's one of the reasons why I brought the three into this book. It's Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Jane Addams. All three of them are progressive with a small p of the progressive movement. But they all have different perspectives on what America should be doing as far as this war is concerned.
There seemed to have been, in my view, I was going to ask this question, but you mentioned him, so we'll just kind of discuss it for a second and move on. We're actually recording this podcast on November 22nd, the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. It seems to me there have been 5 celebrity presidents: Washington, Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Jack Kennedy, and Barack Obama. When you reach that status, and please either disagree with me or add a president or two, it's hard to overcome that shadow. And Wilson seemed to have looked at Roosevelt with a jaundiced eye for that reason and some others.
I might throw FDR on that list, perhaps, but I would agree with all your other ones. Coming back to Wilson, they're very different individuals as far as Roosevelt was also, from a personality perspective, was just a more outgoing, forceful personality who was very hard to resist. Even Wilson, who did not like Roosevelt, obviously for obvious reasons. There's a quote in the book where Wilson said something like, "He is hard to resist as a personality. He's so captivating. He's so much joie de vivre. Wilson wasn't like that. Now, on the other hand, I think people tend to think of Wilson because he was an academic. Wilson had been got a PhD in political science, and he was president of Princeton. People tended to think he was, he's an academic, he must be kind of serious, but he really wasn't in his private life. And actually, he was more outgoing and more personable, like jokes, like limericks and things like that, and was more than capable of carrying on a very passionate relationship with a widow, as we talk about in the book. He loses his wife in the very early days of World War I, but within a year, he's already found another woman, and he's writing her passionate, almost obsessive letters almost every moment during his free time in the middle of some serious crises, the Lusitania sinking and things like that. So Wilson is a very complex individual, I would say, but very different personality-wise. And he was not someone who was going to attract the kind of fanatic loyalty that Roosevelt did. People who were Roosevelt people just loved him, and they would walk through a brick wall for him. I think Wilson commanded respect, but not that kind of fanatic hero worship.
We should also mention, of course, that Roosevelt was a soldier who was awarded 100 years later, but was awarded the Medal of Honor, I think in 2001, posthumously. And we should also mention his son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr., received the Medal of Honor for his actions on D-Day. Teddy Roosevelt Jr.'s, when Omar Bradley was asked the bravest thing he had ever witnessed as a soldier, Omar Bradley replied, "Ted Roosevelt, Omaha Beach." So it ran in the family.
Yes, and he raised his sons to have that sense of duty and certainly a belief. Roosevelt always said, if there's a war, I and my sons are going to go. There's no question about it. And of course, that's another one of his great frustrations, Roosevelt, is that he wants to go over to serve in World War I. And he's going to go to Wilson. At the end of the book, he goes to see Wilson, and Wilson holds his fate in his hands. I won't give it away in case people are going to read this book, of course, but there's a great confrontation between Roosevelt and Wilson when Roosevelt has to kind of lower himself to go see the man who he has vilified in print and for the last 3 years, to ask him if he can go over and serve.
The subtitle of your book, "You Give Teddy Roosevelt Top Billing," was that a conscious decision?
I think it was the publisher's decision, probably because he's the big name of the three. He is this name. I admit it. Jane Addams is the least well known of the three. We can talk about her briefly here if you want.
Well, that's actually my next question. Let me just say you're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're talking with Dr. Neil Lanctot, author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and Their Clash Over America's Future. Before we actually started the podcast, I said to you that I had not read about Jane Addams in a long time and had forgotten what a total badass she was. Incredibly impressive. Tell us a little bit more about her and her work.
It's funny you use that term because my publicist, who's a young woman, when we first started talking about the book, she used the word badass also, a very 21st century term. But I think it does apply to her. And for your listeners, I mean, Jane Addams was a reformer. I mean, she was someone who grew up in privilege in the Midwest. And she was a very intelligent woman, but didn't really know what to do with her life. But she eventually drifted into what was called the settlement house movement. She and a friend opened Hull House in Chicago. And these settlement houses, as they were called, were places where the poor in these neighborhoods, they were set up in poor neighborhoods, they'd almost be social service agencies. Now, today, it doesn't sound like a radical thing, but in the 19th century, this was like, working with the poor and trying to address because there were no social service agencies at all, especially middle class and well-to-do women who were very involved in this movement, running things. This was a great jumping off point for Addams, and she soon became involved in the whole reform movement in general, and then what we call the progressive movement. And by the early 1900s, she was probably one of the best-known women in the country, maybe the possible exception of Helen Keller. I mean, very, very famous. Everyone knew her. Everyone knew the work she did. And she sort of had a reputation as being an American saint, as a do-gooder. But there was another side to her. She was involved in some very controversial causes like pacifism. She was also very much involved in the suffrage movement. She was involved in the civil rights movement. She was involved in the NAACP when they got started. So she was truly part of almost every liberal reform movement in the early 20th century. And as I said, she was famous. She was very famous during her time. Everyone knew her as the selfless Jane Addams American saint. Roosevelt had worked with her when he ran for president in 1912, and Jane Addams actually joined the Bull Moose Party, which was the party that Roosevelt established after the Republicans wouldn't nominate him. So she had worked with him. They're going to quickly split when the war begins because Jane Addams had a very different idea of what America's responsibilities were as far as this war was concerned. Addams believed that we should be doing everything we can to bring peace to the combatants. She was a pacifist, but she was not necessarily a pacifist and maybe in the modern term where she was nonviolent and all that. She believed that it was archaic to have fighting like this in the 21st century, to have men slaughtering each other, that there should be ways to solve differences between countries through some sort of, mediation or whatever. What she wanted the United States to do is some sort of conference of neutrals, bring all the neutral powers together who would start some sort of effort to bring the warring parties to the peace table, that the United States would be the prime mover in bringing both sides to the peace table and getting them to hammer out some kind of agreement. That's what she felt the United States should be doing. Nothing more than that. And that becomes her entire cause for during the course of the period before we get involved in the war from 1914 to 17 is trying to get Wilson to somehow get the United States to take the big jump to bringing the warring countries to the peace table. That's what she feels we should be doing.
She famously was president of the Women's Peace Party and was instrumental in organizing the International Peace Conference at The Hague in the spring of 1915. The attendees were ridiculed as the Peaceettes.
Addams
but what was the impact, just very quickly, what was the impact of Addams's efforts and then her extraordinary tour of the European capitals after the conference had ended?
Yeah, Addams does things that people, because I said she was very venerated before the war, but the things she's going to do during the war, during this pre-period before American involvement, are going to be very controversial. As you mentioned, she's going to be involved in this Congress of Women at The Hague, and afterwards, there's going to be this movement that they're going to send representatives from this peace conference to visit representatives of all the warring countries. So Addams is going to go to Germany. She's going to meet with the German leaders. She's going to go to France. She's going to go to England. It's really quite amazing. I mean, it's citizen diplomacy before it truly existed, and a woman doing this. And all of the warring countries are going to feel, well, we must see her. Because if one sees her, then the others have to. Otherwise, they're going to look bad. Because they're all fighting a PR campaign, for the rest of the world, the neutral power. So she will go. She will talk to all of them. That will be heavily criticized in the United States. How dare a woman do this? How dare a woman stick her nose in diplomacy? Only the diplomats know what's going on. She'll also get in trouble, so to speak, when she comes back home and she makes a speech at Carnegie Hall and makes a statement to the expression that how many of the soldiers need artificial means to get them to use the bayonet and charge. And this becomes this: how dare she question the bravery of soldiers? How dare she say that they need to be given alcohol to charge? And she didn't really say that, but there's a resistance to her because she's not following the establishment view of the war. The establishment meaning the big city newspapers. So she will be viciously attacked for much of the war. And to her credit, that doesn't bother her. I mean, she
was factually correct.
Yeah,
I believe she was.
Yeah, and she's willing to stick her neck out. I mean, there's a quote in the book where her niece said that Clarence Darrow once told her that Jane Addams, one thing I like about her is that she has courage. Very simple way of putting it, but she did. She was not concerned if public opinion turned against her. I mean, that's interesting too about the three of the individuals. Roosevelt, Addams, and Wilson. All of them are at different times going to be very unpopular, or their stances towards the war will be very unpopular. But they're willing to do that. They're willing to take the unpopular side to pursue what they believe is the right path for the United States.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest is Dr. Neil Lanctot, author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and Their Clash Over America's Future. Woodrow Wilson's reputation has been under pretty significant attack for the past few years. Forget just this book for a second. As an historian, is this attack justified? This reevaluation?
I suppose to a certain degree. I mean, the greatest attack has been his racial views, which I touch on a little bit in this book. When the war begins, there happens to be a delegation of African Americans who go to the White House to protest the segregation that's going on in the federal department. When Wilson comes in, his cabinet members, most of his cabinet officials, push for segregation in government, in the government jobs, in a lot of the civil service positions. And Wilson doesn't stand against it. I mean, he's perfectly fine with it. So a delegation goes to see him in the White House. And what's interesting is that there's a transcript of this interaction between Wilson and this delegation led by this editor, William Monroe Trotter. And it gets very heated at times. I mean, Wilson, is a Southerner, and Wilson, he's not happy that an African-American man is kind of speaking up to him. And it's interesting. He tries to explain, Trotter, the African-American editor, tries to explain to Wilson why segregation is wrong. He's like, separating us makes us feel that we're not equal to our brothers, our white brothers. Wilson just can't grasp that. He's just like, that's, this is to avoid friction. There's nothing wrong with this. And if you think so, and eventually the Secret Service comes in and escorts Trotter out. But that was Wilson's view. I mean, he never could get beyond what he was raised on. I mean, he was from Virginia. He grew up during the Civil War. He was born in 1856 when he hit the war. He was, I guess, 8 or 9 years old when the war ended. So he never could see African Americans as being equal. He could not see segregation as a bad thing. So viewed through a modern lens, yes, of course, it's unacceptable. I would still say he was not a rabid race baiter. You know what I mean? He was not filled with, horrible racial views, as far as there were many far more extreme individuals in Congress at that time than Wilson. Wilson was just someone who he couldn't get beyond what he'd been brought up on. He believed segregation was acceptable, and he couldn't move beyond that.
All three of the main actors who you mentioned in your subheading, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Jane Addams, received the Nobel Peace Prize. Roosevelt in 1906, Wilson in 1919, and Addams in 1931. Is this just a coincidence, or is it meant to represent a common thread?
It's funny because I don't think I realized that so well into my research for this book. I probably could have used that as a thread, but it's funny because they all had very different ideas about peace. Now, Roosevelt, of course, always had the reputation as a warmonger, and he would even argue at times with Jane Addams and her followers. And Roosevelt would say, I'm no warmonger. Look at me. I won the Nobel Peace Prize. I helped bring peace to the Russian and Japanese war. I helped bring those parties together. It's just that my view of how peace can be achieved is very different from yours. I don't believe that your approach is totally wrong. My approach is right. So all of them had different ways and different views of how things should be brought about. And we can jump ahead. I don't really talk about in the book, but the League of Nations. Roosevelt died, when the war was ending. Roosevelt died right after the war ended. But in the last months of his life, he was not really particularly in favor of the League of Nations, at least the way it was going to be constituted. So he would not have agreed with what was going on, or he might have accepted the League of Nations, but with a number of loopholes built into it, which Wilson would not accept. And
in your book, you detail somewhat Roosevelt had his own conception of a world league.
Yeah, that in the very early days of the war, Roosevelt wrote a series of articles which were widely syndicated, and he did talk about in some time in the future there might be some sort of almost a world police force where various nations could get together and act in unison to punish global wrongdoers. But as he said at the time, this would be far in the future, and certainly we in the United States can't participate right now because our military is so insignificant. And this was sort of his way of, again, pushing for greater preparedness as a nation. He said at one point, and I think I have this in the book, where Roosevelt said, there's not a country in the globe that has more wealth but less opportunity to protect it.
And we should note that he's the man who sent the Great White Fleet sailing around the seas. Yes. He was a terrific naval historian and disciple of Mahan, and thought that much like the Kaiser was. And I think Teddy Roosevelt and the Kaiser met. They did meet. They
met, I think, in 1910, around there, 1910 or 1911, I recall. And they did have this interesting interaction, because a lot of people thought that the Kaiser was personality-wise like TR to a certain degree. So it was this, great meeting. And Roosevelt was actually disappointed when he met the Kaiser, because he thought he was going to be able to talk to him about a lot of different things. But afterwards he said all he knows are armies, and there's not much else you can talk to him about. Kaiser Wilhelm spoke fluent English, so it was they had an interesting conversation. But Roosevelt never trusted the Kaiser, even while he was president. And there's, Roosevelt, I think at one point said that Germany, ever since unification, had basically menaced every country it could unless someone stood up to them. That they've always had their fingers outstretched, and that's why he viewed them as potential danger. And he also saw them. During the early days of the war, he said Germany comes out in front in this war. If they win this war, they may at some point try to team up with Japan. He was already thinking that. He was thinking far ahead. So he saw Germany and potentially Japan as being potential threats to the United States in the future, depending on how the war turned out. So he was under no illusions about Germany or the Kaiser.
This period in American history is replete with intriguing historical characters, and your book mentions several of them. Other than the three main actors we've been discussing, who plays a major role in your story?
There's a bunch of, I would call them secondary characters who I think are quite interesting in this book. One of them is James Norman Hall. James Norman Hall, I used him to illustrate the stories of Americans who went to go fight before the United States actually joined the war. Hall was a guy from Iowa who was a would-be writer, and when the war starts, he's in England and he joins the English army. And he basically tells them, he pretends to be English, and then the English recruiters know, we know you're not, but just pretend you are. And then they accepted him. And so I use his story because he wrote very interesting letters back home to his friends and family about what's going on. He talks about the training. And then when he goes into combat, he spends about a year in the British Army, comes back home, immediately he wants to go back. And he ends up going back to France in 1916. This time he joins up with the French, but this time he's in the Air Corps. So he learns how to fly. So he joins the French Air Corps. And then later on, he serves in the American Army. So he serves actually in three different armed forces during the war. And he wrote many, many letters home, which give us a great snapshot of what's going on. And your listeners may not know that Hall later became famous as a writer, and he wrote Mutiny on the Bounty. Which, of course, I think everyone knows at least that. He wrote many other novels, but that's what he's most famous for.
This is a incredibly unfair question. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a advance warning and dispensation.
I love unfair questions.
So in 1 minute or less, we've been discussing kind of this movement in a roundabout way, and I meant to ask this earlier, so forgive me. Progressivism was a significant political and social movement at this time. Use all your PhD powers and define progressivism for us in this time period and what it meant to Roosevelt, Wilson, and Addams.
It's a good question, not an unfair question. And it's something that when I was writing the book, my editor had said, try to explain it, because progressivism is hard to explain to people. I've found it's hard to explain to students sometimes. But I think the best way to understand it was just a reform movement that kind of swept the United States from about the 1890s up to maybe the early 20s, if that. And it was a movement that emerged in response to, I think, threats from above and perceived threats from above, meaning the super wealthy and the super giant corporations that are taking over, and perceived threats from below. All these immigrants are coming over, and we have to reform. So it's just this idea that society itself has a lot of issues that need to be addressed, and the reform movement. The reformers themselves that participate in this movement called their movement progressivism, as an idea that it's progressive. So I think that's just the simplest way to see it. It's almost an umbrella movement encompassing all kinds of different reforms. It could be ending child labor. It could be regulating big business. It could be cracking down on gambling. I mean, it's so many different kinds of reforms, or even the initiative or the referendum. I mean, so it cut across a lot of different things. And you could be a progressive and support one reform and not another. So it's very, very unlikely that you would, in fact, as a progressive, support all these different reforms. But as I said, it's an umbrella term. Addams, I think, was the most progressive of the three, in that she was on the forefront of just about every reform movement of the day. Roosevelt got more and more progressive. I think he was a Republican who was leaned left when he was in the White House. In his last years in office, he moved even farther to the left. And then when he was out of the White House, he went really whole hog into every progressive cause known to man. Same thing with Wilson. I think they saw the country was turning that direction, 1912, 1913. They all started to get behind it as almost this is a strong political force in this country. And we've got to get behind it. So I think it was sweeping the country. What's unfortunate for people like Addams is that when the war comes, it does almost grind the movement to a halt to a certain degree. The momentum slows when the war comes in.
The Great War in general seems to have been the result of an incredible happenstance in Sarajevo in June of 1914 when a man who decides not to throw a bomb just happens to be standing a few feet away from the person he was going to kill with the bomb as the Archduke's driver can't figure out the car. It's one of the most incredible things I've ever read in history is how Gavrilo Princip just happened to be there sulking, and there's the car with the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's unbelievable how that happened. But besides this happenstance, it's also the war was a result of decades of planning by the great powers, all of them, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, France. Was it realistic once the war started and then it metastasized and became this unprecedented conflict? Was it realistic to think the United States could stay out of it unharmed?
Unharmed, no. Stay out of it, yes. I think it was possible that Wilson could have kept the country out of war. One thing I did talk about in the book, even when the vote for war, when the resolution goes to Congress in April 1917, the war resolution, the vote was 373 to 50. But at the time, many said that if it had been a secret ballot, it would have been closer than that. Many Americans and many in Congress, again, we talked about this earlier, particularly in the Midwest and the South, still didn't see the point of it, still felt we could avoid this. And I think Wilson, had he said, we're still going to continue being neutral, we'll do armed neutrality, which was his suggestion before, we'll arm our ships, we will not fully declare war. I think there was a possible route to be taken there.
In May 1915, the British liner Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat. How did this affect American attitudes towards the war, President Wilson's? And describe for the Leaders and Legends audience what Teddy Roosevelt's reaction was.
I think that was one occasion where if Wilson had said, I want to bring back Congress and vote on a war resolution, he might have been able to get it through because the country was worked into a frenzy. But for a very brief time, I don't think it lasted more than maybe a week or two. I think people calmed down. I think the death toll was 118 or something, like in the hundreds. It wasn't like a tremendous amount, but it's hard for us to understand.
Americans.
Yes, Americans. Yeah, I think it was 1,100 all told, 1,200 all told, and maybe 128 Americans. But the idea of a passenger ship being sunk was just so inconceivable at the time. It just was like that was violating international law. I mean, it's inhuman. It's just not done. So, of course, by World War II and even by the end of World War I, these type of things would not be shocking anymore. But it was shocking at the time. And so Americans were extremely, extremely upset about it. On the other hand, when Wilson, a couple of days out, the sinking was on a Friday, and Wilson, I think on Monday, went to speak in Philadelphia for something he had been planned months earlier. And everyone's waiting to see what Wilson's going to say. Is he going to say, we need to go fight, America must be strong? But instead he says, there is such a thing as a man who is too proud to fight, or such a thing as a country which is too proud to fight. So that was a signal that the country is not going to go to war. We're going to maintain our cool and our self-possession. It was a very Wilson word. It's belief that we can't be knocked off our strong emotional moorings, so to speak. And I think the country, as angry as they were, most people were happy about that. Now, was Roosevelt happy? No. I don't know if Roosevelt was ready to go to war, because what could we have done at that point? We have no army to speak of. But I think Roosevelt felt a more forceful reaction was necessary. Perhaps severing of ties with Germany. Certainly different things should have been done. There's a quote that Roosevelt even made at the time, is that there are things that are worse than war. America losing its heart, losing its pride, that's worse than war. And what's interesting about Roosevelt, he's in the middle of a libel case when this is all going on. He's being sued. His fate is in the hands of a jury almost at this point. It's about to go to the jury. And there was a concern because there was one, maybe two German Americans on the jury who might have gone against him because he's making these comments. But Roosevelt, as I said, was not afraid to take the unpopular choice at the time. Jane Addams at this time was in Europe. She was doing her jaunt to the various capitals. And she felt that Wilson was doing the right thing also, that taking the country into war or doing anything that might accelerate America's path to war was a big mistake. But that was probably the time during this period where Americans were most ready and revved up. Even if it's a very short period, but I think he might have been able to pull the country into war had he been so inclined.
We are fascinated in this country with our history when it comes to close presidential elections. Election of 1800, 1876, 1960, 68, 2000, list goes on. To me, the most unexamined, and you do a terrific job of it in your book, is the 1916 election, in which Woodrow Wilson wins re-election by 23 electoral votes. It basically comes down to California, and I think Wilson wins California by what, 4,000 or 5,000 votes?
Yes, it's a ridiculously small number. I agree with you, and I think it's a fascinating election, not because I spent how many years of my life researching this book, but 1916 is an election we don't hear that much about, but it was so close. And the stakes were so high. I mean, you have Wilson running for re-election, of course, and the Wilson campaign is going to trumpet, he kept us out of war, which Wilson's not that comfortable with because he knows that can change at any one moment. The Republicans, Roosevelt wanted the nomination, doesn't get it, and it goes to the Supreme Court Justice Charles Hughes. And Roosevelt's on the stump for him and is out there trying to drum up votes for Hughes. But everyone knew it was going to be close. And Roosevelt himself said before the election, couple of days before the election, said it's probably not going to be known for a few days, and he was right. But on election night, it looked like Hughes was going to win. He was leading throughout the country. He won New York. Newspapers are coming out. The evening newspapers on election night are saying Hughes is the winner. They even go to Roosevelt's house, gives a statement saying, I'm so glad this national embarrassment is over. Hughes is president, yay. But then by the next morning, as votes from the West start coming in, everything starts shifting. And then there's a fairly long count. I mean, I think it's not until Friday of that week. So the election's on Tuesday. I think Friday night, as I recall, is when they finally can conclusively determine that Wilson has won. It's interesting, the elections at that time, which I don't think I fully realized until I was doing the research, that the South was just basically, it was a given. All the votes were going to go to Wilson. The Republican candidates got negligible support in the South. So every Democratic nominee in those days started out with getting all the former Confederate states. They start with 100-something electoral votes. So that was a fairly big advantage. And of course, because African Americans could not vote in the South, they were kept from voting. So the South was the solid South for the Democratic Party. So the election was almost more close than the actual raw votes attest to. So because you can't really compare the votes in the South because Republicans were negligible. And as you mentioned, California was the one that turned. If Hughes wins California, he wins the election, and it was 4,000 or 5,000 votes. And some it was, again, some progressive issues that Hughes was I think a progressive, not a hardcore one, but when he had been governor of New York, he had been a progressive. But when he ran this campaign sort of in a way of like, I'm not going to offend anyone. I'm not going to come out too strong for progressivism. I'll try to sort of cling to the center of the Republican Party. And he went out to California and didn't do enough to really curry favor with the progressives in California, particularly Hiram Johnson, who had been governor, later became senator. And that may have cost him the election, because if he had done more in California and had seen the right people and had curried more favor with the progressives in California, he wins California, he wins the election, and everything changes. And that was, again, a history-making election, which people probably don't give credit to, because if Hughes is president, again, things might have changed than a Wilson presidency.
We have a few more minutes with Dr. Neil Lanctot, author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and their clash over America's future. The United States did not enter the war until April 17, but throughout the war, Imperial Germany claimed that during the course of the conflict, America had hardly actually been neutral. Is this a fair and accurate accusation?
It probably is. The Wilson administration early on decided we're not going to lean too hard on the Allies as far as some of the international violation of international law that the Allies were doing. Much of it involved interference with American trade, which is a very, it annoys people in the United States a great deal. I mean, that American ships are being stopped and they're not allowed to trade with neutral countries without the British, stopping them and things like that. So it annoys Americans a great deal. It annoys Wilson a great deal. And the Wilson administration sends out a lot of protests, a lot of notes, but they never say, if you keep doing this, we're going to cut off trade with you. They never lean terribly hard on the Allies. Part of the reason, I think, was, of course, the economic windfall we were getting from trade with the Allies. The United States, on the other hand, is much tougher on Germany, much more willing to make ominous threats as far as German behavior is concerned. Now, of course, what Roosevelt said at the time was, yes, the Allies are doing things that are not really kosher either. But the issue is one violation involves property, which is the Allies interfering with trade. The other side involves human lives, with the Germans submarines attacking ships with the loss of American lives. So that's the difference, and that's why we have to be tougher on the other side. So the Germans were very resentful of the United States, and that's one of the reasons why they never could accept. Wilson always had this idea he was somehow going to be able to help bring peace and somehow facilitate peace. But the Germans were only willing to have Wilson bring the combatants, the contestants, to the peace table, but they did not want Wilson in there as some kind of arbitrator. They felt he was too sympathetic to the Allies.
And one thing that I mentioned, or should have mentioned a few minutes ago when we were talking about geography, was the great concentration of German immigrants in the Midwest, in cities like Milwaukee, St. Louis, and that there was a different attitude, not only geographical, but also in terms of national origin. How did that make a difference in American policy, where you had sort of the East Coast with a different ethnic makeup, although you did have a hell of a lot of Irish who hated the British and didn't mind seeing their ears get boxed. But just in terms of the immigration boom, the post-Civil War, and how that affected not only the politics, but some of the attitudes of the people involved.
Well, one thing I didn't realize before I read this book was just how significant the German American population was in the United States. It was very, very large, very, very, very sizable. And they were sort of looked on before the war as the ideal immigrant group, that these people had come over here and they had immediately worked hard, and they had been farmers at first, and then they had become parts of the community, and they were just the ideal group. And as you mentioned, in the Midwest, you have these really large German populations. I have this little passage in the book about Milwaukee, as you just mentioned. Milwaukee was a giant German population, and how some of the department stores expected the help to be fluent in German. I mean, that's how significant the presence was. And there was also this issue of the German American vote politically was thought to be sort of a rock vote, and there was always this thing that don't alienate the German American vote; it could cost you the election. On the other hand, as you mentioned, you have different immigrant groups who have different attitudes towards the war. You have a large Jewish population on the East Coast who have different attitudes about which sides they're going to take. You mentioned the Irish and their views towards the war. There's always this sense that Wilson is trying to tamp down any kind of possible flare-up among the immigrant groups as far as the war is concerned, that we don't want anyone getting too excited. And of course, once the war begins, America gets involved, there's going to be a lot of anti-German activity in this country and a lot of hostility towards Germans. In the buildup towards the war in 1915, 1916, and 17, there is always suspicion among some people about the Germans in this country. Just how loyal are they? Are they involved in espionage? Something I talk about in the book, that the Germans had all kinds of spies going on in this country in the buildup of the war. They were constantly trying to interfere with munitions sent to the Allies. And there were some German Americans who participated in those efforts to disrupt shipments being sent to the Allies.
And the Kaiser, I read a book a couple of years ago about the relationship between Germany and the United States, and the Kaiser and the German government kind of expected that. Like, I know you live in the United States, but you're German. You're on our side now. And that didn't really happen to the degree that the Imperial German government thought it would.
Yes, that was a complete fantasy. And another one of the secondary characters in the book is Johann von Bernstorff, who was the German ambassador in Washington. He understood the American situation better than everyone else. He was someone who had an American wife. He knew exactly what was going on. He tried to tell them what was going on. But back in Berlin, they had this sense that, of course, the German Americans, they will all rise up as one once if America goes to war with Germany, and they will immediately, do what they can for the fatherland. And that was very naive. And I think after the war, Bernstorff there's a quote where he said something like, the great mistake was that we expected much more than we ever got from German Americans. Yes, there were some hardcore German Americans who were ready to go fight for the Kaiser, but many of them, as much as they might be like hoping that the Germans won because that's where their family was from, when push came to shove, they were going to support the United States. That was their new home, and they believed in America.
We should note that this podcast originates out of Indianapolis, and we have our own sizable German population, have one of the most beautiful buildings in the Midwest called the Athenaeum that was built as part of that culture. And I guess German immigrants must have been really popular because North Dakota named its capital after the Iron Chancellor in the hopes of attracting German workers to come out to the frontier. A couple more questions before we get to the final 5 questions of the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're talking to Dr. Neil Lanctot. The Zimmerman note or Zimmerman telegram seems to be, if I can remember my college and high school history courses, it seems like it gets a strong notice in history as being this dispositive event. But one of the things that comes through in your book was Germany's declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, the second time they had done it in the war, that declaration was just too much for the United States to absorb.
I think that was the end. And I think the Germans knew it was the end. I mean, in early 1917, the German, the military and the Navy basically had this sense that, well, we've waited long enough for someone to have peace brokered. It's not going to happen. So we have to do everything we can to end the war because we can't win a long war. So what are we going to do? We have to throw everything we can and try to end the war this year. How do we do that? We unleash the submarines. We starve England, and England, it will sue for peace by the end of the year. That was the theory. That was the very optimistic view of the people in the military and the Navy. There are a few sane people in the government who thought this is not going to happen. It's unrealistic, but no one really stood in the way of it. And I think no one else they had no other idea what to do at this point. They knew it was going to bring the United States, but the thought was again that, okay, they'll declare war on us, but it'll take them a year to put an army in the field against us, and the war will be over by then. So they thought they had all the bases covered, but they were as greatly mistaken as it turned out. As far as the Zimmerman note, I think it's been overstated its importance. I think it was important, but it was such a crazy idea that kind of germinated from one particular individual in Germany. The idea was more about, let's see if we can put a lure out to Mexico, get the Mexicans to tie up Americans on the border so Americans won't be able to send troops over to Europe as soon. And maybe if we get the Mexicans interested, they can possibly bring the Japanese somehow into this fight on our side. That's what the Zimmerman note was all about. It was totally ridiculous to think that, the Mexicans are going to invade the United States and have a chance to win back Arizona and Texas and all this. Everyone knew it was a crazy idea, and even people in Germany knew it was, and the German leadership later on. It's even thought that Zimmerman barely looked at it. But what happened with the note was sent and was intercepted by the British. The British sat on it for a while, then they eventually turned it over to the United States, and then it was leaked. The Wilson administration leaked it to the newspapers. And again, it got people very, very upset. The Germans are fomenting war on our border. They're trying to take away our territory, but that was never going to happen. Mexico was basically a mess in many ways and was a very unstable country. They certainly not be able to mount a serious war against the United States and take away territory from us. But it seemed to show how Germany would stoop to. There was no limit to what they would stoop to at this point. So it did get the country very worked up. Did it stampede us into war? I would say no.
It's interesting. You tend to think that a lot of these wars, when you read about them, that the outcome is preordained, right? Like, of course, this is how it's going to end. But any reading of World War I leaves you somewhat astounded at the strength of Imperial Germany, that they held off Great Britain and France and Russia. They had one of their allies in the Triple Alliance flip on them, meaning Italy. Their other ally, Austria-Hungary, was basically a sieve. They did tie up some Russian troops, but more often than not, the Germans had to come to their rescue. This is an immensely powerful country in the world, but yet their war strategy really kind of centered on three rolls of the dice: the Schlieffen Plan in 1914, unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, and then Operation Michael, their all-out offensive in the West, in 1918. Ludendorff, their famous strategist, looked at the Kaiser one time and said, "We cannot fight the whole world," but yet they did. Do you think the United States was the reason that Imperial Germany lost that war?
I mean, it may be perhaps simplistic to say that, but I do think they had a huge impact on it. I think it broke down the resistance. Not the word I want to use here, but I think it broke down the morale of the Germans, of saying the Americans are just pouring into the country. I mean, there's so many of them. It's like we've been in this death struggle with the French and the English since 1914, and we're both very wary. And all of a sudden, all these fresh troops are coming over. How can we possibly deal with them on top of who we've been dealing with for 4 years? So I do think that was probably very disheartening. And there's a quote I have in the book where I don't remember which German military official states this in 1918, saying the Americans are multiplying in ways we never thought was possible. I think the Germans also did not think it was conceivable how a million American troops would get across the ocean and be deployed in this way. So I do believe that the outcome of World War I was very much determined by American involvement. Bernstorff, who I mentioned earlier, stated this later on. He said, if America stays out, there's a good chance that there is no winner in this war, and maybe that would have been a better thing because maybe democracy would have come to Europe instead of what happened in the 1920s. I'm not sure that maybe that's a very rosy view of what might have happened. But again, I mentioned this earlier in the interview. I think we can all see almost a totally alternate scenario if the United States does not get involved in this war.
And it's not only the numbers. If you read some of the letters from the German officers who these letters have been included in other histories of World War I, it wasn't the sheer numbers of the Americans that impressed them, even though it did. Another thing that impressed them was the condition of the Americans. They were bigger, they were stronger, they were healthier, they were more vibrant because they hadn't been grinded down for years in these trench warfare battles.
Yes, that is a very interesting part of the picture when these Americans come over and they all just they look totally different from the soldiers who had been involved in this terrible struggle for 4 years. And the American soldiers who go over, of course, they learn how to fight relatively quickly. I mean, they acquit themselves rather well and prove that they're not just going to be a pushover. I think the Germans, originally thought, oh, well, they're not trained. They're not, what are they? But they ended up showing that they could more than hold their own.
The last question before we get to the 5 questions. Is it fair to say that of the 3 people who are featured in your book, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Jane Addams, that Jane Addams had the happiest ending?
I think I would agree with you. Roosevelt spends World War I very embittered. When the war ends, he actually goes to the hospital, I think, on Armistice Day, spends about a month in the hospital, gets out of the hospital, comes home, and then dies of, I think it was a cerebral hemorrhage. So he has a very unhappy end of his life. Wilson, of course, successfully runs the war. Has issues at Versailles, which I won't even get into here. Then, of course, when he tries to get the League of Nations through, get the United States to ratify the League of Nations, gets Congress to ratify it, he suffers a massive stroke in 1919, and he is never the same mentally or physically, and then dies in 1924. So certainly the end of his life is quite unhappy and certainly a great decline. Addams, during the war, is kind of vilified as being still part of the pacifist group. And even into the 1920s, she's seen as a dangerous radical to the point where the FBI is watching her and spying on her. But by the late 20s, early 30s, there's sort of been a turnaround. I think as we get farther out from the war, and people start seeing World War I as a mistake, Addams' reputation starts to improve. In the last 3 or 4 years of her life, she is again honored and venerated and praised, and really, really takes her place in the sun once again, to the point where I think she's honored as well. She gets the Nobel Prize, Nobel Peace Prize late in life at that time as well. So she does, I think, end with, I think, her career on the upswing and her place in American history on the upswing. Now, unfortunately, I think her reputation has sort of suffered in the last not reputation, I think her prestige as far as an individual, as far as an important figure in American history, has suffered, which hopefully this book will correct. I think she certainly deserves a lot more ink than she has received up to date.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Neil, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Number 1, what was your first job?
My first job was washing dishes.
What was your first concert?
First concert.
We're about the same age, so don't embarrass me.
I think it was Elton John. Sometime in the 80s.
That's a damn good one. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I think fiction, one of my favorite books of fiction is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, which some of you may know of. This is a guy who wrote basically one book. He couldn't really sell it. He ended up committing suicide, and the book was later published years later. It's one of the great comic novels written. That would be my favorite. I think probably my book I would recommend for fiction. For nonfiction, I really like the book Middletown, which is a great study of the 1920s, written in the 1920s by a husband and wife team, Helen and Robert Lind. They went into Muncie, Indiana. This is appropriate for you. Have you ever heard of Middletown?
No, sir.
So Middletown is this seminal work on the 1920s, and the Linds went to what they considered the average American town and studied it for 2 years like anthropologists. And they went to Muncie, and then they wrote up this massive book explaining what's going on in this community and how American life was changing in the 1920s. It's an absolutely fascinating book. So I like Middletown as my nonfiction recommendation.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I'm going to go with a sports one. I have written about baseball, so I'm going to take a sports one. And this is the one I would like to have witnessed, would be Babe Ruth's called shot. There's great controversy whether Babe Ruth actually called his shot. This is in the 1932 World Series. It's this great moment when Babe supposedly pointed his bat to the stands and hit a home run. And then there's great debate whether did he really do it or not. So I'd like to have been there to see if he did it.
I should say that I interviewed columnist George Will not that long ago. And his answer was, I asked him if he could witness any event, and he said Bill Mazeroski, Game 7, World Series. He said he says nothing's even close, which I thought was funny. Number 5, last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Living today?
Yes, sir.
I think Paul McCartney.
Terrific choice. And no one had really chosen him, but you're the second person in the last 3 podcasts to mention him. He would
probably, because he's out there so much now, but he has so many stories to tell, and he lived through so much. That's what made me think of him.
He has some great interviews with Howard Stern on YouTube, if you ever want to look them up.
Yes, I've seen some of them.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Happy birthday, Chuck McGinley, November 22nd. And McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been Neil Lanctot, professor and author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and their clash over America's future. Thank you so much for your time today. Your book is absolutely amazing, and we really appreciate you discussing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.